Hey Freckles, what is going on? Kokyu asked. Maomao didn't answer him. She went straight for the hut where the old man lived. She didn't want to stand and chat with the two of them. She was desperate to test the idea she'd had as soon as possible. Even as she ran, a smile came over Maomao's face. Boy, where did that come from, she wondered. What is she thinking? Chuyu grumbled, but he and Kokyu followed along anyway. Chuyu must have grown tired of running partway there, because when they arrived at the shack, Kokyu was carrying him on his back. Maomao vaulted up the stairs and knocked on the door. No sooner had the old man opened the door than she burst out, "Give me some tobacco seeds." Gramps was slurping noodles, looking almost as if he were eating his own beard. "Is that why you are here? If there weren't any seeds in the field, too bad." He began to chew his mouthful of noodles noisily. Maomao had been expecting something like this, but she had an idea. "What if I told you I could identify the notorious shaman?" she whispered. The man's unpleasant chewing stopped and he set down his chopsticks. "Kokyu, come here. Take this and go entertain the kid." He pulled a ball off the shelf and tossed it to Kokyu. Kokyu failed to catch it and had to run outside after it with Chuyu trotting behind him. With the interlopers cleared out, the old man motioned Maomao to sit. She sat down in a chair and looked out the window at the marsh. She said, "Let me venture a guess. When this shaman appeared, it was the time of year when the water level was dropping. The painter had seen the white-haired, red-eyed woman about 6 months ago, give or take. That would be the season of little rain. Less water in the marsh would mean more bog." "That's right," Gramps said. "And the shrine maiden did her dance at roughly the same time of year, am I right? I don't see what that has to do with anything." Maomao moistened her finger in the water jug. Then she started sketching a map on the tabletop. She drew a circle representing the lake, after which she added the little island and the bridge. Gramps likely had trouble seeing the water map, so he offered her a brush and some paper. They were simple materials but easier to see with. Maomao began to write. She pointed to the riverbank closest to the island, the point farthest from where the river flowed into the marsh. "Was that where the rain dance was performed?" "Yes, that is right," the physician said. The place could be seen from the window of the hut they were now in. This shrine maiden or shaman or whatever she was invoked the blessing of the great snake god. She walked across the water. "What if I told you I could do the same thing?" asked Maomao. The old man squinted at her, clearly skeptical. "That is enough silliness from you. If I might say so, I do not think you have the figure to attract the snake god. Gee, old man, I did not realize you were such a devout believer." Their eyes met. Maomao smiled, trying to provoke him. She thought this old man knew something he wasn't telling her. It was almost as if he could read her mind. "Liuhumen would never operate on an assumption that way," he said. "That is exactly why I want to investigate the marsh, to substantiate that assumption." Gramps gave her a glare, but then got up as if inviting her to follow him. "You don't seem to enjoy a little mystery in life, do you? Not that I am one to talk. What we should do at a moment like this is simply believe that immortals and shrine maidens really exist." The old man almost spat out the words, but then he called to the pair playing with the ball outside. "Go buy something that will pass for dinner." He gave Kokyu some change. He clearly did not think the ball would distract them for very long. "Now listen, kid. This man is always getting cheated. Sorry, but could you go with him and keep an eye on him?" "Sure, just leave it to me," Chuyu said and went after Kokyu again. Maomao and the old physician stayed where they were until the other two were out of sight. Then the doctor said, "Let's go." He led her to a fenced-off area of the marsh. Floating plants grew on the water's surface. Maomao frowned at the boggy ground. She took off her shoes and held up her skirt as they walked. Gramps hiked up the legs of his trousers. The water was dark and cloudy. "The shrine maiden walked from here to the island. If you can manage the same thing, I'll tell you whatever you want to know." Then he dropped his voice to a menacing whisper. He said before the shrine maiden, the young women who were brought here were called sacrifices. They were drowned in this marsh. Tied to weights, they sank into the fathomless depths while still alive. My great-grandmother told me how she tried to cover her ears as the girls cried and sobbed their last breaths. Each attempt at struggle dragged them closer to their doom. There are no guarantees you won't end up the same way. It may have been a revered custom, yet it must also have been a terrifying sight for the villagers who witnessed it. They felt remorse for what they had done and begged forgiveness. However, it meant nothing at that point. Stone pillars stood around the marsh. They were constructed of similarly sized rocks piled one atop the other. The largest of all stood on top. Cairns of some type perhaps, so how exactly did the maiden cross the marsh? The old man asked. Maomao took out some rope she had brought from the house along with a couple of thin wooden boards. All right if I borrow these, she asked. Suit yourself, he replied. Thank you, she said. She punched 3 holes in each board and ran the rope through them. This created what looked like crude sandals. They weren't very impressive, but she put them on. She thought paddy sandals would be perfect right now. Paddy sandals were footwear used by people planting rice fields, but wishing wouldn't get her anywhere. The old man was watching her curiously now, and for the time being she kept quiet. She rolled up her robe to keep it clear of the ground. Then she wrapped a rope around her body, tying the other end to one of the stone pillars. Then she began. Hey, what are you doing? Gramps asked, substantiating. Maomao put a foot in the marsh, or more properly, she almost kicked against it. The impact caused her foot to bounce back. The old man was startled, but Maomao was already taking her next step, kicking forcefully. She did this again and again, working her way across the bog. She was indeed walking on water. It wasn't quite the way Kokyu had suggested. She took each step before her foot could sink, then repeated the process. It was enough to keep her on the surface. How's that? I can walk on the water. Maomao grinned, full of confidence. The old man touched his beard, astonished. That's something special, I'll give you that. He picked up a long stick lying nearby. He took a step into the marsh and plunged it into the water. There was a hard, sharp sound. You do not have to go to all that work. There are more of those cairns in the marsh. He struck the large stone pillar again. What? Maomao said, flabbergasted. She stopped moving her feet in amazement and they promptly sank into the bog. Gramps ended up having to pull her out. How did you do that anyway? Gramps asked the mud-covered Maomao after he had extricated her. Maomao took off her shoes and looked at the marsh, tired. When you have something that is not quite liquid and not quite solid, it has some special properties, she said. It would have been easiest to demonstrate if she had some potato starch. You could mix that into water at a specific ratio and pick it up with your hand, but it would soon flow out between your fingers. This marsh was very similar. That is why Maomao had asked Gramps what time of year it had been when the maiden danced across the water. Maomao had put on her improvised footwear because she judged there was a little too much water to do otherwise. She figured some of the sacrifices had noticed that when the marsh shrank and the ratio of mud to water changed, you could walk over it. But she hadn't been quite right. A gimmick like this is not very fair, she said. The stone pillars sunk in the marsh are grave markers for the dead sacrifices, the old man replied firmly. They were buried so that even in the dry season they weren't visible. There were 10 of them, perhaps a few more. That was the number of women who had been drowned. Long ago, when the time for the next sacrifice was decided, the son of the village chief told the unfortunate girl about the grave markers. Then the young woman who had the Lord of the Lake on her side became the shrine maiden. That was more than 50 years ago now. The previous village chief evidently hadn't known about the stones. It looked to Maomao as if this man here was the only one who was aware of them. She glared at him. He had known all along, and he had kept quiet about it. Why would he do that, except perhaps if he felt guilty about something? Maomao asked again, was the shaman a woman with white hair? But the doctor shook his head once more. He said they had not had anyone like that around there. However, he did have something else to add. He began speaking, telling Maomao about how he had run into the former shrine maiden in the capital by sheer chance. She had been sent to the rear palace. By then, she had a granddaughter. The former shrine maiden asked him what the state of the great snake god was today. The physician explained that even without a shrine maiden, improvements in flood control technology meant the river and the marsh no longer overflowed their banks. The snake god became simple superstition, and his shrine went to ruin. Now no one visited it. I can't help thinking maybe it would have been better if I'd told her the shrine was doing well, that thanks to the great snake we were safe from floods. Even if it wasn't true, he said. The former shrine maiden had been incredulous at what the old man told her. It was as if all the shrine maidens who had gone down to the depths had died in vain. The thought enraged the woman. Not long after, she and her granddaughter came to the village. The former shrine maiden said she served a new snake god. It was then that she had her granddaughter cross the marsh. A new snake god. Maomao thought of the white sacred ropes. She also thought of the snake deity and the white-haired woman the painter had seen. She picked up the pole and plunged it into the marsh. As she worked toward the little island, she sought out the cairns. The old man was right. This was a more reliable method than the one Maomao had tried. As long as your feet were steady, you could make it. She hopped over to the island. The island was home to the dilapidated shrine, rampant wild grasses, and flowers with small red petals blowing in the wind. These flowers did not live long. Some of the petals were already dropping, leaving bare plants behind. Were they planted here or had some seeds simply dropped in the area? All Maomao knew was that the plants should not have been here. Poppies, she heard the old man say. From his tone she could tell he was discovering them for the first time. Perhaps he had not visited the island before, even though he knew the way. May I ask you another question? Maomao said. Go ahead, I will tell you anything now. How is it that you know about the grave markers? Gramps smiled. You know I am related to the shrine maidens, which means I am a slave's son. It is not unusual for the powerful in a village to get involved with the slaves. He had said it was the village chief's son who told the former shrine maiden about the burial pillars. That would seem to imply the chief had gotten a slave woman with child, and that child was Gramps. When the chieftain tired of this slave, she was passed on to the next villager. Finally, when starvation threatened, she was used as a sacrifice. For there to be grave markers, there had to be someone to put them up. Someone had to cut the rock and pile stone upon stone over the course of years. It was also necessary to carry the stones to their location across the other markers that were already in place. This marker, just in front of the island, is the last one. It saved my little sister from drowning, the doctor said. Then, instead of staying with him, she had been sent to the rear palace. It was not the village chief's daughter who had gone missing, but the child of the slave woman and whoever she had been given to. When the child returned decades later, she discovered that the villagers who had murdered her mother and used her own life for their purposes had forgotten all about the local deity and the women who had been sacrificed as shrine maidens to it. Maomao looked at the tobacco leaves on the far shore. Did you get those from the former shrine maiden? I did, but not the poppy seeds. She gave the tobacco to me as a souvenir, asking for 2 favors in return. Will you tell me about those 2? Yes, it is time I told someone. The water level is still high right now, so they have stayed hidden. When autumn comes, the tops of the grave markers will peek out. I was able to keep everyone off the trail until last year, but I don't think I can manage it anymore. The shaman would be revealed as a fraud. The first favor was this, that I stay quiet, even knowing what I knew. The injunctions against the villagers killing snakes or birds were probably the shaman's small form of revenge. This old man might object to her methods, but he chose to look the other way. The elderly physician, looked at his stilt hut. The other was that I give her free use of my pigeon coop. Pigeon coop? What in the world did she want with that? Maomao asked, tilting her head in confusion. She had also heard pigeons cooing in the village. Did they usually keep these birds free range? The rule to not kill flying birds almost seemed like an afterthought compared to the rule about snakes. Maomao worked her way back across the grave markers toward the hut. Several times she almost slipped on the slick stone, but she was in a hurry to get to the pigeon coop. As she approached, her nose prickled at its distinctive odor. Inside there were several dozen birds. They had dark greenish feathers. They flapped excitedly, surprised by Maomao's sudden arrival, but she ignored their reaction. Instead, she grabbed each one and tossed it aside. Hey, leave the poor birds alone, Gramps sputtered. He considered them to be more than just food, but that didn't matter to Maomao at the moment. She finally found what she was looking for. She grabbed a bird around the back and flipped it over. Then she plucked off the thing attached to its leg. It was a piece of twisted white string. The space was grimy in places. She guessed it had gotten dirty while the animal was outside. Maomao left the pigeon coop and undid the string. It turned out to be a single piece of cloth embroidered with characters. They really did look like a scribbled snake. I know I have seen these before, Maomao thought. They looked very much like the embroidery on the fire rat cloak she had seen at the used clothing store. If you knew what you were looking at, you could tell it was not a random pattern. It was a code based on characters from the Western Reaches. Maomao thought back to the fortune teller from the Western capital. She had used a pigeon feather instead of a brush to write with. For some time now, Maomao had been grappling with the fact that the White Lady somehow seemed to be everywhere at once in this country. Surely the young woman couldn't actually travel so widely. Her albino appearance might make her seem uncanny, but she couldn't actually use magic like the immortals were said to do. It was practically the reverse, in fact. With skin so sensitive to sunlight, she wouldn't be able to spend much time outside in bright regions. So it wouldn't be the White Lady herself who moved about. Maomao assumed she directed confederates instead. The difficulty with that idea was information. To free the lion from its cage or to connect with consort Lishu's half-sister, the White Lady needed a fast way to exchange information. This exchange needed to happen between the Western capital and the imperial capital in the central region. It would take even the fastest horse more than 10 days to reach the west from the capital. The return trip would take almost as long, even if one traveled by boat. How had she solved that problem? These pigeons did it. Hey Gramps, does the former shrine maiden herself come to visit the pigeon coop? Her granddaughter does. She took several with her, saying she would use them for a curse. Won't you eventually run out of pigeons? No, they return to this coop when I release them, unless an animal or a human catches them first. In other words, she could communicate using these pigeons' natural ability. Maomao closed her eyes. She thought for a second about what she should do, and then she looked at the old man. It was possible harm would come to the former shrine maiden and her granddaughter. They seemed like they might be connected to the White Lady. Maomao clicked her tongue. Want to work with me this time, Gramps? What are you talking about? Maomao wasn't entirely bereft of decency. She could go straight to Jinshi without saying another word to the old man, but she chose not to. Instead she began to negotiate, feeling out how far he would go, and where in the middle he would meet her. Chapter 12, The Trials of Consort Lishu. Jinshi got a letter from Maomao the day after his informal meeting with the messenger from the west. The letter said, I found a clue about the White Lady in a village called Golden Lake. It was most convenient for him, or perhaps most inconvenient. The messenger from the west was one of the emissaries from Sheo who had visited Li the year before. Her name was Eileen. She and her companion had looked so much alike they might have been twins, but the other woman, Isla, well, matters turned out to be complicated. When last she had visited, Isla wore a red hairband and Eileen wore a blue one. This time, Eileen's entire garment was blue. She wore a simple Kwaju Sheni for her covert mission. It was a robe with a curved hem, quite common in Li. Truly, she was not someone Jinshi should have been meeting with so personally. She had last seen him dressed as a woman. She had rather embarrassingly mistaken him for the moon spirit. He was also busy, she knew. He wondered what she would talk about right now. He wondered whose guidance she was following. It turned out to be Lahan's guidance. Jinshi had thought he seemed to be up to something in the western capital. He felt certain Lahan of all people wouldn't be doing anything sketchy, and he let the matter slide. It wasn't that he trusted Lahan so much. It was that he had a certain understanding of the other man's psychology. Lahan had a particular fixation on beautiful numbers and unbeautiful numbers. Jinshi could not quite understand it, but he gathered that Lahan would not do anything that violated his standards of beauty. Jinshi had expected about half of what Eileen said to him. The other half had been unexpected, but none of it was completely unreasonable. Lahan already knew the 2 points Eileen had mentioned, and he hadn't reacted strongly. One thing she said did bother Jinshi. It was the question of food exports or political asylum. Lahan had already discussed exports with Jinshi, specifically a root vegetable called sweet potatoes. The crop was promising. It could be grown even in poor soil and yielded a harvest many times that of rice. The fact that Lahan could bring him this idea immediately upon his return to the capital reminded him that the La clan was quite capable. As a result, Jinshi had spent the 2 weeks since his return working with little sleep. Catching up was difficult enough, but there was still more work to do. His worries at the rear palace were not finished. Another troublesome situation had appeared. He needed to explain the exports to Sheo to the bureaucracy. It was unlikely that saying they were a protection against insect plague would be enough. All the measures Jinchi had already taken against the plague had seemed sufficient. Any preventative moves made by the members of the bureaucracy were to forestall a catastrophe they foresaw for themselves. They did not want to give themselves more work because of some groundless anxiety. That was the reality of the situation. So Jinchi devised a pretext. The forced labor to which the criminals captured during the Shiklan rebellion would be assigned would be agricultural work. Everyone would agree with opening new lands for that purpose. There was a lot of land in the former Shiklan domain of Shihokushu. Now that the Shi family's control over the region was broken, negotiations would likely be easier than before.